Andrei Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in the village of Yabluchna, Sumy Oblast. His father Roman was a descendant of a dispossessed peasant. The origin of the Chikatilos surname itself is unknown. In his mature years, Andrei tried to find out, but to no avail. When World War II started, he was only 4 years old. His father was conscripted into the Red Army. He soon began to command a partisan detachment, and the care of the boy and his older brother Stepan completely fell on the shoulders of his mother, who worked at the local state farm. It is possible that the terrible pictures of the war years affected Andrei's psyche, the consequences of the bombing and the bodies of the dead, who were taken to the burial places on carts. And at the end of 1942, the Germans came to the village of Yabluchna. After gathering some of the residents, the Nazis led them to be shot. Curious boys ran after them, among whom was 6-year-old Andrei. The children had no idea that after the adults were shot, the Germans would open fire on them. In front of Chikatilo's eyes, his peers were falling, mowed down by bullets. At some point, Andrei stumbled and, hitting his head on a stone, lost consciousness. He woke up among the bloodied bodies. The SS thought that he was dead and threw him into the pit along with the others. From fear, Andrei could not move and lay among the dead until the morning. In 1943, Chikatilo's younger sister Tatiana was born. This story in the family was shrouded in mystery. After all, the girl was born at a time when the head of the family had been at the front for a couple of years. According to some reports, Andrei's mother could become pregnant after being raped by a German soldier. Be that as it may, after the birth of Tatiana, the Chikatilo family was on the verge of survival. In order to somehow drown out his hunger, he even had to eat grass and roots. At that time, he had the main fear of his life, the fear of being eaten. It was this fate, according to Andrei's mother, that befell his older brother Stepan, who was kidnapped and eaten by his neighbors. Distraught with hunger, there is a version that the boy was eaten by his own relatives, but it has no reliable confirmation. Moreover, it has never been established whether this incident actually occurred, or if a Stepan Chikatilo even existed. The fight against the Nazis for Andrei's father ended in German captivity, where he worked in a mine and spent some time in a concentration camp. Roman was liberated by the Allied troops, but the camps of Komi and Chuvashir were waiting for him at home. Chikatilo Sr., who was sick with tuberculosis, was sent there because of suspicion of complicity with the Nazis. Having survived in a concentration camp, he did not survive the Soviet camps. Andrei went to school at less than 8 years old. In 1944, at the same time, he was a very absent-minded and timid student, forgetting a notebook and ink at home. Chikatilo was embarrassed to ask for help from classmates and a teacher and simply cried. Sometimes the student fell under the desk in a hungry faint. Andrei plunged into despair and the fact that he could not see what was written on the board, because he suffered from myopia. By the way, Chikatilo began to wear glasses only after 30 years, when he stopped being afraid of the nickname Okkarik, which was offensive to him. Andrei's hysterical behavior turned into constant ridicule and bullying from his peers. They beat him, called him woman, and a weakling. But he did not dare to give them back. Chikatilo complained many years later. All my life they wiped their feet on me. They didn't consider me a person. Everywhere. Meanwhile, during his school years, Andrei was fascinated by politics. Chikatilo said that by the time of Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, he, a 16-year-old teenager, had such a deep knowledge of Marxism and Leninism that he could easily rule the Soviet Union. After graduating from school as an almost excellent student, the 17-year-old young man decided to become a lawyer and in 1954 applied to Moscow State University. However, he could not do so, because he did not pass the competition. However, Chikatilo found another explanation for himself. As the son of a repressed man, he was simply blocked from entering a prestigious university. The only thing that Andrei managed that year was to enter the communications school. Located in the urban-type settlement of Aktyarsky in the Kuban. But Andrei did not leave his dream of higher education and, after graduating from a technical school, decided to become a railway engineer, enrolling in a correspondence department at a capital institute. But 2 years later, Chikatilo abandoned his studies and at the age of 23 joined the army. First, he got into the prestigious at that time KGB border troops in Central Asia at that time. And then, thanks to his education, he went to serve as a signalman in Berlin. According to some reports, during the service, Chikatilo could become a victim of sexual violence by colleagues, which left another imprint on his psyche. After demobilization, Chikatilo decided to start life from scratch, moved to the Rostov Oblast, and got a job at a telephone exchange in the settlement of Rodionovo-Nesvetayskaya. Along the way, Andrei began to write notes on various topics for local publications as a freelance correspondent. Life got better. In 1963, Chikatilo married and entered the Rostov State University, in the correspondence department of the Faculty of Philology. Then he enrolled at the University of Marxism and Leninism. Having received the coveted diplomas, Chikatilo decided to become a teacher. In 1970, he got a job as a teacher of Russian education and literature at a boarding school in the city of Novoshakhtinsk. It would seem that everything was going well. But the 34-year-old teacher began to show oddities. He began to harass the students, pretending to be a caring teacher. Chikatilo sat down with schoolgirls, supposedly to explain difficult moments in his studies, and he began to touch the girls. And sometimes Andrei waited until the students began to get ready for bed and undress, after which he suddenly entered their bedroom. Soon, talk about the inappropriate behavior of the teacher reached directors of the boarding school, and Chikatilo himself gave rise to dismissal. On one of the warm days, he took his students to swim in the local reservoir. At some point, Andrei noticed that one of the high school students swam far away. Depicting concern for the life of the girl, the teacher swam up to her and began to molest her. The schoolgirl began to fight back, and Chikatilo suddenly realized that he was excited by her screams and resistance. But this trick cost him his job. Chikatilo was forced to write a letter of resignation of his own free will. In fact, some oddities in sexual behavior and difficulties in an intimate matter manifested themselves in Chikatilo during his school years. According to his recollections, he received his first sexual satisfaction in the 10th grade. Once, a 13-year-old girl came to visit his younger sister, but neither Tatiana nor their mother was at home at that moment. And Chikatilo, feeling excited at the sight of the blue pantaloons that peeked out from under the guest's dress, attacked the girl. He threw her to the floor and lay on top of her. And already from this, he felt satisfaction. And even though the schoolgirl did not understand anything, Chikatilo himself was ashamed of his act. After this incident, he decided that he would only have sex with his wife. Chikatilo decided to marry at the age of 25, but his chosen one answered him with a sharp refusal and stated that she would not associate her life with an impotent. Moreover, before refusing Andrei, the girl discussed his intimate problems with her friends. As a result, the whole village where Chikatilo lived found out about this, and he once again turned into an object of ridicule. His later attempts to have sex with women invariably failed, and Andrei, admitting that he was impotent, tried several times to commit suicide. As a result, Chikatilo got married at the age of 27 to Feodosia Odnicheva, a friend of his sister Tatiana, who introduced him to each other. Chikatilo and Feodosia lived peacefully, although the couple had problems with intimate life. But, despite impotence, Andrei nevertheless became a father. A daughter and a son appeared in his family with a difference of 3 years. At the same time, secretly from his wife, Chikatilo regularly went to prostitutes. In 1978, having worked for a short time as a master of the teaching process in the city vocational school, 42-year-old Chikatilo moved with his family to the city of Shakti. There he got a job as an educator at a local school. Deviations in his behavior became more and more noticeable. Not embarrassed by those around him, he put his hands in his pants pockets and touched his genitals in front of the students. Those, in turn, ridiculed the teacher and called him a pervert and an onanist to his face. It all ended with the fact that one day Chikatilo put his hand into his 15-year-old pupil's shorts. The teenager made a fuss, to which his peers ran. The crowd attacked the pedophile and beat him. After this incident, his teaching career came to an end. According to his criminal case, Andrei Chikatilo committed the first murder in the same 1978. Having moved to Shakti, Chikatilo bought a dilapidated hut house with secretly accumulated 1,500 rubles, where he took girls of easy virtue. On December 22, he promised to treat with imported chewing gum and lured an 8-year-old into his hut house. But as soon as the gullible girl went inside the room, the maniac threw his victim on the bed and began to tear off her clothes. Yelena screamed and began to fight back, which angered Chikatilo even more. Having experienced sexual satisfaction, he hit her several times in the stomach with a knife and then strangled her. Having abused the body, he carried it out of the house and threw it into the local river Grushevka. As soon as the deceased girl was found, investigators began interviewing local residents. Some of them remembered that they saw the murdered girl in the company of a strange man. An identikit was compiled, and a little later the director of the vocational school, where Chikatilo worked, confidently identified him as his employee. Andrei's wife, in a conversation with the detectives, kept silent about the oddities that began to happen to her husband recently. In an inadequate state, he ran away somewhere, then returned, looked for something, and ran away again. Moreover, Feodosia lied to the investigators that on the day of the murder Chikatilo was at home, so the murderer had an alibi. Meanwhile, law enforcement officers were in a hurry to report to the leadership about the successful disclosure of the crime before the new year. While some detectives were talking with Chikatilo's wife, their colleagues detained a certain Alexander Kravchenko, who had previously been convicted and served 10 years for the murder of a little girl. At the same time, Kravchenko's wife assured that on the day the crime was committed, her husband was at home, Kravchenko was initially released but was soon brought back to the militia station because he had robbed his neighbor. The operatives put a drug addict in the cell with the suspect, who beat Kravchenko, demanding to confess to the murder of the girl. He could not stand it and signed a confession. At about the same time, militiamen intimidated Kravchenko's wife. They promised to bring her in as an accomplice if she did not confess to giving false evidence that her husband was at home. As a result, the operatives got their way. They immediately forgot about Chikatilo, and Kravchenko was tried and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Later, under pressure from the relatives of the deceased girl, his case was reviewed, and he was sentenced to death. Andrei Chikatilo himself kept a low profile after the first crime because he was afraid that the next murder would result in his capture. However, a few months later, the maniac killed a 17-year-old vocational school student Larissa Tkachenko. According to some reports, the girl made a living by prostitution, and she herself agreed to go with a stranger to the deserted bank of the Don. Chikatilo tried to have sex with her, but once again failed, and the student raised a laugh against him. As the killed recalled, she said that my machine didn't work and he started laughing. This, of course, pissed me off. After all, I was disgraced. I began to diffuse my psyche. I started cutting her everywhere without looking. A terrible death awaited his second victim. Chikatilo bit off the victim's nipples and filled her mouth with dirt so that she suffocated. During the investigation, the killer himself confessed to these two crimes. Nevertheless, the prosecution could not prove these episodes. But Chikatilo's involvement in the next murder of a 13-year-old schoolgirl Lyubov Buryuk, whom he murdered in June 1982, was fully proven. Following her in the same 1982, the maniac dealt with 6 more children aged 9 to 16 years. He looked for his victims at railway stations, bus stops, trains, and buses. He looked out for children who were without parents. Chikatilo got to know them, rubbed their trust in him and, under various pretexts, took them away with him. He promised entertainment, chewing gum or something else. Sometimes children followed their killer for several kilometers. Chikatilo mocked them, dismembered them while the victims were still alive, cut off the genitals, cut out the insides. The detectives who followed the trail of the maniac at first thought that they were dealing with a mortuary employee who knew a lot about the rules for dissecting bodies. The gender of the victims did not play any part for Chikatilo. It was much more important that, due to their young age, they could not repulse the murderer. Killing. He felt his strength and power over the victims but still, choosing another target for reprisal. Chikatilo preferred teenagers with blonde and straight hair. Killing his victims. Chikatilo gave free rein to his sick fantasies. Sometimes he used the blade of a knife as an artificial penis. He plunged it into the body of the victim and made movements characteristic of sexual intercourse. But the most important thing for the killer was to gouge out the eyes of his victims according to some reports. Chikatilo read somewhere that his portrait could be imprinted on the retinas of the dead, which he was very afraid of. According to others, Chikatilo felt shame and guilt in front of the victims and did not want them to look at him at the moments of the crimes. Chikatilo sometimes took parts of the bodies of the dead with him. His wife recalled that the maniac always took a small saucepan with him on business trips. The killer himself admitted that he cut out the genitals of the victims to eat. He read somewhere that this method improves potency. As for the clothes and shoes of the victims, Chikatilo cut them into pieces and scattered them around the area. There were always traces of blood and dirt on his clothes. Sometimes Chikatilo washed them off in the public toilets of railway stations. Later, he admitted that militia officers sometimes caught him, but he did not arouse any interest in them. Studying the remains of the victims of Chikatilo, detectives sometimes refused to believe that these crimes were the work of a sane person. The investigation was inclined to believe that children and teenagers were killed by a mysterious psychopath. In 1983, they had the opportunity to confirm their guesses during the investigation of the episode, which went down in the history of national criminology as Delo Durakow. The Case of Fools. **to be continued** Sources